Hello, this is Dan, and you're listening to Red in the Face. Before we get into the episode today, I just wanted to warn listeners about some of the topics we're going to discuss. In light of the recent events, we thought it was extremely important to talk about Sarah Everard's murder and discuss gendered violence in society more generally. Therefore, we will be discussing with our guests issues around gendered violence, and we will talk about rape and sexual harassment. Solidarity to all of those that are victims of gendered violence. And we hope that this episode adds to the discussions going on around the UK at the moment about what we can do to ensure that women can live their lives in a safe environment. To have this discussion, I am joined by Red in the Face co-host Jared Williams and two special guests. Our first guest is Rachael O'Byrne. Rachael is a member of the Reclaim the Night Liverpool organising group. She's a community worker and has been an activist in Liverpool for over 10 years. She has previously served on the Rape and Sexual Assault Merseyside Board and volunteered with women's charities across the city. Our second guest is Sarah Doyle, who is an activist in Liverpool as well, an active Unite the Union member and a Labour City Councillor representing the Riverside Ward. We were going to be joined by Rachael Baylis, who is a comrade from Worcester, but something has sadly come up, so she isn't able to make it. I just wanted to mention that Rach is running to be the president of Brighton University's Student Union on a platform of tackling sexual violence and harassment on campus and in the city as well. So I'll put some links to her campaign in the episode description.
This is lower, this is upper. This is the oppressed, this is the oppressed. This is the exploited, this is the exploiter.
Hierarchies that exist in the family. Hierarchies that exist in the school.
Is it right that so many people live in such poverty in a society surrounded by such riches? No, it obviously is not.
Because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions.
So, yeah, first of all, thanks both so much for coming on. I know it's been a difficult week for women, difficult week for activists in this area, because every day just seems to be like a punch in the gut for lots of people. I think we maybe start off in what possibly is the most difficult place, really, and talk about Sarah Everard and what has developed really since she was reported missing. Currently, what we know is that she was walking home from a friend's house. After being confirmed missing, her body was then found and identified in a woodland area in Kent. A serving police officer has been arrested on suspicion of the murder and is set to appear in court this week. And then to add to that, a planned vigil for this Saturday was called off by organisers after negotiations with the police. But people still gathered to pay their respects, and so they should have. However, then those in attendance were kettled by Met Police and arrested, and God knows what else. So I think somewhere to chat about to begin with, really. I don't know, maybe we'll start with you, Sarah, and then go to Rachael. Before discussing the Met's actions on Saturday, maybe just start by discussing how you reacted to the news over the last week and why this sort of story is resonating with so many people on different levels.
It was strange actually when I first heard about the case, and I'm currently doing my master's in law, so we have like a little WhatsApp group, and in the WhatsApp group we keep an eye on stories that are happening that are in the media. And one of the first things we flagged up was the fact that I know me and some of the people in my class said this is like a white young woman and it's in the headlines, but how many young Asian women or how many young Black girls have similarly had something terrible happen to them, have gone missing, have disappeared, and their families also traumatized, but they don't get the headlines. And I think that's something really important to factor in. Another element of violence against women, and how that the attention that focuses on it is disproportionate sometimes depending on the ethnicity of that person. And we were keeping an eye on it and trying to be the future criminal lawyers that some of us are. We were saying, it's really interesting because where Sarah went missing, there was an issue with CCTV, and they had to get CCTV from a person's private camera. And a few of us said, oh, this looks suspicious. We think this might be linked into a person of authority because of the fact that they knew there was no CCTV in that area. And all of us was throwing things around. And then And I remember like speaking to my mum about it, and because it was the name Sarah, she was just like getting really, really upset. And she was saying to me, you know, you just never know what can happen. You never know, like you could be walking home or you could be doing the route you always do. And I was just like thinking to myself, like, God, this is such a sad state of affairs that my mom thinks this, my nan thought that, I think this about my nieces. And it's this like generational fear amongst women, you know, that we have to be wary what way we take to get home, or we have to make sure that, and I know this is a lot of stuff that's on social media, but we have to make sure that we text when we get in, or we text when we're like near. And I just think how it's almost been ingrained that that is normal. And if you think about it, if someone was texting you all the time, say, you know, are you okay? Are you safe? You'd probably think like this is a bit strange, but for a lot of women and a lot of girls, this is normal. And I think, how has this happened? How is it that when I would be in like my form class, a lot of the girls next to me would get texts from their moms or from their aunties, whoever was like there in the morning, have you got to school okay? And I just think, how has it got to this point?
Yeah, and on the point you made as well about what sort of gets covered in terms of sexual violence. I mean, sexual violence against trans women goes massively under the radar as well, even with certain Labour MPs who decide not to read the names out of trans women that have been killed as a result of sexual violence. So there's a lot of layers to that. And yeah, all of the issues that you said there have been coming up on social media. I don't know, Rachel, if you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, I think I was reflecting on this earlier, because I think that for a lot of us, this was a case that kind of happened in slow motion. And I think that's kind of each sort of, it was changing by the hour. And I think that was quite horrifying to witness that kind of being played out on social media, this case. And I think there's still more to happen. And I think it is that realization, I think, that the violence that we experience as women and as trans women, cis women, non-binary people, that we so often just have this like low level misogyny that just exists in our daily lives, that we're told that we have to accept in exchange for being part of a society that brutalizes women. And I think that horrifying kind of megaphone to this moment, I think has really frightened a lot of people, and also put a spotlight on some of the things that activists have been talking about for quite a while. And I think that fear that so many women will have experienced at some point, and that's, you know, I did think that realization of that low level fear that just exists, and it's truly heartbreaking. I don't think that we have come to terms with that yet, and I think that will happen over time. And so I just think that this is a moment to really reflect on kind of what type of society do we want to live in, and what type of society are we expecting women to live in. And I hope that this is a wake-up call to a lot of people, particularly men, who do have positions of power and can actually make significant changes. And that's not just in personal behaviour. I'm talking structural power as well. And the structural power that men sometimes abuse, and then sometimes just don't do anything with it to actually raise these issues, to challenge these issues that women face every single day. And so I do hope that this is the moment, because it has to be, because I just don't think that this is the life that any of my sisters should have to live.
I think what you say about it, obviously the statistics that, you know, we'll talk about sexual violence and cases going, cases just not getting prosecuted against, etc. None of that, and I heard this on a Navarro podcast, that none of that plays into. So, for example, the statistic that's really hitting home with a lot of people at the minute is 97% of women aged 18 to 24 in the UK have been been sexually harassed, according to a survey. But that figure will be the fear of sexual violence ingrained in women's minds is at 100%. Because as you say, this doesn't show in the figures the fear that they fear with every day. And that point where it goes to that sort of, your natural reaction is that fear. And yeah, it's ridiculous. And I think that important within that, sort of going against those statistics, is personal testimonies of women. I think are really hitting home now, and lots of people have come forward and said, really brave women coming forward with some horrific stories to sort of really add to this. And I think the parallels are really there with last summer now, with the Black Lives Matter protests, that we're sort of, it feels like we're in that moment now where hopefully there's going to be sort of more of a debate about this moving forward, hopefully. I think, is there another element to it, with this case specifically, that has it added to it, that obviously it is a serving police officer, that perhaps that element comes in, that obviously we'll talk about policing attitudes in a little bit, that the people that are actually meant to protect people in this instance are the ones that have literally done the crime. And obviously we'll talk about the wider implications of police in a bit. Do you think that's added a layer sort of to it as well?
Can I come in quickly on that?
Yeah.
So I've talked to Rachael about this before, and Rachael was talking about this like fantastic idea of how the city council can make the streets safer and like bars and clubs safer, and like Rachael can speak about that in more detail. But I think it's this feeling, for example, if you go to a nightclub or a pub or like some sort of like nightlife scene, and you have a man harassing you, and you have a man that's making you and your friends feel very uncomfortable, more often than not, if you go up to the bar or to a DJ, I've like gone to a DJ booth many times and been like, there's a creep who's like really making me feel uncomfortable, and he's like trying to get close to us in a way that is like, we don't want that. It gets dismissed. Or if you go up to the bar, and it is not, I'm not saying that it's on any one person to be able to challenge this. It's like a collective attitude that needs changing. And as Rachael said, it's looking at the fact that this is an underlying thing that is sort of accepted almost. People know it's wrong, and people will refer to someone as like, oh no, they're being a creep or they're being a perv or whatever. But it's like sort of accepted that there's levels of it, which is okay. So if you're in a nightclub and there is someone brushing up against you and making you feel uncomfortable, that's sort of tolerated to a certain point. And I think these tolerated attitudes have just sunk into such a depth that it set the ground for police officers, for example, to do these terrible things. And also, some people might say, well, how can we expect a DJ in a bar or like bar staff to challenge this when, for example, if you go to the police and you try and report something to do with like gendered violence, or you report that you've been harassed in some way, the rigmarole of what you have to go through to try and prove it, never mind to get a prosecution. If that's what our judicial system is saying, then yeah, people in workplaces or on buses or anywhere, actually the one thing, I was on a bus, and me and my niece, who is 15, there was a person making us feel extremely uncomfortable. And so I went to the bus driver, explained it, and he just said, I don't want to have it kicking off on the bus. And I thought, I wasn't even angry at him, because I thought, well, he's under loads of pressure as well, and like he's just trying to get to the end of his shift. But it's like this general attitude of just put up with it, and if it gets worse, we'll deal with it. And I think because people have pushed it away for so long, it's now just accepted in some way. And
like you say, that there seems to be, like you say, a preconceived line in people's heads of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, but that line moves, and people are pushed further towards it.
I think it is this kind of what's considered as like low level. So I think that just, it's really important, I think, in this moment that we start listening to women. And I know that there are lots of comrades who are men who have been listening for a while. And so I think it's worth acknowledging that, because I think that is making a difference already. But I think it's sort of listening to the instance that we're describing, and then also getting a sense of what it feels like when that happens. So in the general election campaign, I was with a bunch of activists outside a main train station in Liverpool, and we were handing out leaflets, and a group of men who were like my dad's age, walked past us, and one of them grabbed my bum really hard, and to be honest, it was so, the way it happened was I thought it was my partner who'd done it, and I was like really annoyed because I was like, what, like, we're out campaigning, what are you doing? And I turned around and it wasn't. He was talking to somebody else. And that frightening moment of like thinking, oh my God, what's just happened? I think it's my partner. Oh no, God, my partner's like across the street from me, like too far for me to say, come over here. I was completely on my own. And then like they'd walked off and they were laughing. And then I doubt that man will remember that moment. But for the rest of the weekend, I could feel it. I could feel his hands on me for the weekend. And now that's a low-level incident. But I was so angry, especially because I'm a campaigner against violence against women. And I didn't say anything. I was so shocked by it that I literally didn't have time to like call him out, to scream at him. I just was frozen. And I think like the shame that the shame that I felt from that, of not calling it out, the embarrassment of saying, oh my God, someone's just pinched my bum really, really hard. It was painful. And that moment of just kind of being like fair game because I was out in public, daring to, and then I had to carry on campaigning, and it was just this really horrible incident. And I'm certainly not unique in this. I think that if you speak to any woman or girl, they will tell you they have experienced something like that. And I think that we've got to start taking these things seriously, because why should I felt like that from them, that he is just laughed off with his mates, and feel embarrassed and ashamed just for existing in public.
And like you say, that building of that understanding what these, again, in quotation marks, low level incidents mean, is that just trying to imagine what it feels like to have your space invaded in, and like you say, then it goes back to it, walking away and laughing completely unaffected him, because it's just a laugh, it's a joke. Like you say, it's fair game, it's what happened, rather than you've just invaded someone's space.
Just quickly, because I think there's like a little bit of a parallel to be made here. For example, the way Rachael said, just to feel like fair game because she was out doing stuff in daytime, just being a person. And I don't know why it popped into my head, but for example, if Rachael did choose to retaliate then and did lose her temper and very rightly storm over to that man and shouted and said, why have you done this? And, sort of engaged with him in any way. I've saw instances, and I've been involved in instances whereby the person who has had that happen to them chooses to retaliate. And more often than not, I'd say about like 8 times out of 10 when I've seen this or been a part of it, the person retaliating has like a disproportionate shock to their behaviour rather than the person who has done it. So like I've been, walking in a shop, and the one thing that drives me mad is when a man will just look at you and they're not even trying to hide it. And it's sort of just like, I'm just here and I'm looking at you in a really horrible way and making you feel like you are really small, and it's horrible. And I now have got into like this habit of, I will walk over in COVID, socially distanced, and I will walk over and I will be like, what are you looking at? And I will try and embarrass them in front of people wherever we are, because I think that that's one way of challenging it. And I've had people go past me, women as well, and be like, calm down, like what's the matter, just calm down.
I was going to say, I bet that is the reaction. For example, if Rachael had gone over and said anything, you'd have had 5-6 lads telling you to calm down. where your space has just been invaded.
And I feel like we're getting, and the parallel I was trying to draw was, I feel like we're getting major calm down vibes from the police, which are meant to be the people that are protecting us. And there's angry women, there's upset women, and the police are just sort of like, whoa, like, what are you all doing? Like, calm down. And rather than recognizing the root cause of it, the issues and the behavior that's being sort of like analyzed is the women's retaliation. And I think that's a huge issue in it as well.
I think what sort of sums up how sort of out of touch the police are with the reality of sort of women's lives is the fact that, like, I think after the vigil, I saw on Twitter a thread that a girl reported to a police officer there that she had been flashed after the vigil, and he didn't even offer to walk her home after everything that had just happened, and the very reason why they were at the vigil anyway, and why the police officers were there. He still just said, just carry on walking, get over it, forget about it, kind of thing.
Didn't he say something like, we've got enough to deal with? Like, how can you be so? We know why they can be so tone deaf, because we'll talk about it. But you just think on a human level, you just think, how is that your reaction?
And I think it's how, and it was something that I was aware of, but it wasn't something that I really understood the scale of. And I'm relatively disappointed in myself for not understanding it, but it's probably a misjudgment on my half, which I need to work on. Is how sort of you have to self-police on a regular basis, because you don't have any trust in the system that it will protect you. So you're like, the fact that you have to plan what routes you walk home, or that you have to, keep keys in between your fingers or in your hand just in case anything happens. Like, it was almost like, because we've seen it on Twitter now, how everyone's very bravely putting out their stories. And the scale of that, and like people, I mean, there's even now a petition to legalize pepper spray, I believe. Like, how has it ever reached this point where you can't even go out just to walk home, or that you're having to petition to have pepper spray legalized just so you can self-police yourselves in 2021? It is really sad. It's something that perhaps I wasn't particularly aware of, and I'm a trade union rep, and I have female members, and it's something that is never really discussed in that regard. Obviously, we deal with workplace issues, but you have a lot of gendered issues as well in the workplace, and gendered violence and stuff like this doesn't ever come up, and it's something I think the trade union movement really needs to work on also as well.
I think on that as well, like you're saying, I mean, I don't know what my experience would have been if I hadn't gone to uni and lived with women for 3 years. Then you realise that on nights out and going home, and sort of like the pull on your arm going like, I'm going home, and like maybe in first year I'd have been like, all right, sound. And then by like after a while we're living with them, you realise that no, that means that if there's no one else to take you back, could you please, like, at the very least, get in a taxi with me or whatever. So I think there were a lot of, and we talk about education and things like that, I think people that haven't had that education or live with women or spend lots of nights out going out sort of in mixed groups of men and women just haven't grasped and we won't fully get it, because like you say, we'll never experience that fear in the same way, so we won't fully grasp it. But to some people, just, I mean, for example, we're skipping a little bit ahead, but maybe this is the point where we discuss like hashtag not all men, where you just think, if your first reaction to a outpouring of grief and a wider discussion about gendered violence, if your first reaction is to say, it's not all of us, what is in your head to think that? Why is your first call not, okay, I'm going to learn about this, I'm going to understand about this, and I'm going to see what I can do, not basically just say, oh, it's not me, it's them lot. I don't know if you got as infuriated as I did when I saw that sort of trending.
Well, I think like a lot of men, they're going to feel that that's a normal thing to say, because you've got one of the largest police forces also being like, that police officer is just like a bit of a rotten apple. The rest of us are fine, trust the rest of us. And it is this, systematic thing where you've got an authority figure basically saying, oh, this is one bad person, trust the rest of the police. And therefore that translates down to men also being like, yeah, the same situation with us, it's not all of us. But this is like another thing I've been talking about, and it touches into like Jared's point with the trade union movement. A very simple way to start challenging this, and to recognizing that this is something that is happening with across every workplace, across every friendship group, every interaction that women come into like interacting with, is that you will know someone who has made a woman feel uncomfortable. And it's either, I've got that mate's like a bit of a creep, or like, yeah, he's a bit of a weirdo. I have a former friend who made me feel extremely uncomfortable. My friends criticized him for how he made me uncomfortable, would like get into my bed when I didn't want him to get into my bed, kept keys to my apartment, and let himself in whilst I was getting changed. And this person is still a member of the local Labour Party. People still interact with him, add him into WhatsApp groups, all these things. And the worst thing is, I think, well, of course they're not going to believe me when his own friends who know about this are still great friends with him. And I think if you want to cut that behaviour out, you have to isolate these people, and you have to show that it is wrong and it isn't going to be accepted.
And I think it's about saying it's time for men to stop centering themselves in this discussion. That, when we talk about male violence, talking about the system that enables violence, and actually you talk about men, you're centering yourself in that, and therefore you're part of the problem. When your first reaction to this outpouring of grief and anger and fear that so many women experience, I would go so far as to say pretty much every woman has experienced some form of male violence in their lifetime, and your response to that is to say, well, not me. And actually it might not be you being an active perpetrator, and by that I mean kind of making the choice to be misogynistic in all the forms that takes, but you might be standing on the sidelines and accepting that behavior. You might not have a woman's back, and actually it's about us all looking at it in the same way. That myself as a white woman, I have to acknowledge that I benefit from a white supremacist society, and that I don't do enough, and that will be in my entire life, that will be something that I have to work on, and something that I have to work towards, of being a better ally to Black sisters in the movement, to make sure that they are welcome in the feminist movement. And that will be something that I have to work on for the rest of my life, and I accept that, and it's important that we do, because it's about acknowledging the different levels of oppression that we have in our society, and what role we can all take in dismantling that, but also being aware of what role we play in upholding that. And once we kind of acknowledge that we do that, that helps us take it apart. And so I think that we really need to stop centering men in this conversation. There needs to be a lot more listening. And I think that even now, when I'm saying to people, misogyny exists in every realm within our society, they're like, well, can you give me an example? Can you give me a specific example? And it's like, no, I can't. I'm too fucking busy getting on with my life. I can't.
I think as well, like you're saying about sort of looking at the not all men type argument that people have made, that if you look at the statistics, that the 97% statistic of women aged 18 to 24 in the UK have been sexually harassed, 2 in 3 schoolgirls are subject to street harassment. Like the amount, that's something that I was talking to my girlfriend about it, just saying, does anyone ever shout when you were at school? Does anyone ever shout at you? No, she was like, yeah, happened loads. And it's like, what? It's like, why? How do men think it's somehow acceptable to shout at girls not just walking up the street wearing a school uniform and thinking that's completely acceptable? So if that's 2 in 3, if the one's 97%, well, at some point, like you say, there must be someone in your circle or in your workplace or somewhere that is doing this, because the figures can't be that high. You can't keep your head in the sand and say, well, it's not me, I'm all right, Jack, because 2 women a week are being killed by a current or former partner in England. You know, like all these figures are so horrific and so high that someone's doing it, and it's so ultimately it's going to come back to you. There's going to be people within your group that are doing these things. But yeah, maybe that's something to discuss as well, is that, like you say, it has been a lot of the questions about, similar to almost like to the Black Lives Matter last summer, where it's like, well, what can I actively do? So a lot of men have been asking, hey, what do we actively do about this? Sort of, so maybe looking away at sort of structural stuff in terms of like practical things people think about doing. I mean, is there simple things in terms of just making women feel safe when they're walking home, if you notice women on their own? I mean, that sort of type basic stuff before we look at the bigger structural stuff that I think people are looking towards to sort of see what they can do. I don't know if you wanted to have anything you thought about that.
I think, as I just said previously, about if you know you have a friend or someone that you've organised with, and when I say organised, because I think there's like another layer of sinister to all of this, is that if you have someone that you organise with in like the trade union movement or like in a political organisation, and they can, or you're aware of, they've made a woman feel uncomfortable, they've done some things that are just like people are turning a bit of a blind eye to because they're a bit sinister. That is going to be so difficult for a woman to continue in that organisation or within those circles, because they will then feel almost gaslighted to the point where, well, this person has done a really bad thing to me and they've made me really uncomfortable, but they've got all these people trusting what they say and almost admiring the work they do. And it's so, when you see that, it's so frustrating and it's so disheartening. And the worst thing is that it sometimes makes those women leave those circles and leave that movement when their voices are needed the most. So I would just say a very simple thing is, if you know you have a friend or a comrade that is making a woman feel uncomfortable, or any person uncomfortable, challenge them on it, because I guarantee if they receive challenges on it, it will change, or they will leave the movement. And we do not need any more people like that. We need the people right in the heart of the movement that they are making feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I completely echo that. And I think as well that it's simple things in the workplace as well. Kind of move on from the I think so often we kind of just like put up with these kind of low level kind of issues in our workplaces, in our daily lives. And one of them is kind of like if you work somewhere and someone calls you like a pet name rather than your actual name, I always find that like really uncomfortable. But it's one of those things that is really difficult to call out quite often, because it's said in like this like really friendly way, and you don't actually want to like kind of be that person in the office, or you don't want to be seen as difficult. And so you just have to put up with it. And I mentioned that example because I had a male colleague who kind of picked up that I didn't like this, and they didn't ask me directly. And they just said in a meeting, I think you'll find her name's Rachael. My God, what are we, 1950s? And it just made this like really like stupid joke, and didn't become a big deal. But actually just having somebody that was able to say it, and I was able to like come on the back of it and say, yeah, it's Rach, I actually like prefer Rachael or Rach, that's fine. And it was just having that little bit of support from somebody to say like, pet names are really weird and creepy, and please don't use them in the workplace, it's not appropriate. And also that there was an opportunity for me to say, like, if I did like it, like, oh, I don't mind, and to open that conversation. Although I do think that they're not appropriate in any context, and I don't think that we should do it even if you personally didn't mind it, because it's the culture that it creates. But I think that it is about kind of noticing kind of the behavior of men around women in like the workplace and social settings and in kind of our offices, and kind of try and work out like, actually, is this normal? Would that person say that to a man? And if they wouldn't, that's then when we need to start be having these conversations. And I think speaking to men about that is a really powerful thing that men can do.
And I think as well, if you have someone in your workplace that is organising things or even, not even in a workplace, just sort of, an organisation, again, to go back to like a political movement, and they're saying, we're going to be putting this person up for a position, or we're going to be supporting this person. And you start to notice like a bit of a trend that it's just men that they are putting forward for things or supporting things. Maybe just saying, well, why is that? And talking about your women that are colleagues and talking about women comrades and challenging, because I think sometimes it is so ingrained. And the worst thing is being asked, to be the only woman on the committee because they need a women's officer. The exact same with like asking a black comrade, will you be on the committee as our BAME officer? It's like, do I have anything else apart from like a female anatomy? Is that all I'm good for? And I think when you spot these trends, or you look around you and think, well, there's no women on this committee, or there's only a few women to fill the spaces that maybe we don't have men to fill, or looking at like workplace reps, and if you speak to someone and they're like, well, I've just picked these person for that reason, and then speaking to women and saying, well, do you want to go for these things? Why don't you feel? What can I do to help?
I think as well as sort of talking about you say progressive spaces and progressive movements. I mean, I'm sure you've both experienced, because we've had it in meetings, of just loud, shouty CLP man that doesn't just shouts over women when they want to make a point, and like you say, then makes those spaces just feel unwelcoming. And I've seen it in different meetings. I've seen it when I was in Liverpool. I've seen it when I was in London. I've seen it back here at home in like Worcester. It's that same occurrence that God, I think Zoom's been a blessing, because loud, shouty CLP man can just be muted and then you can move on. But I think that's just something that you speak to more and more people about. And again, it's something that maybe when I first got involved, you didn't pick up on. And when you start picking up on it, you think that's the same bloke now every time that someone goes to mention something. And even like, our female councillors and like, people that have taken on roles in the party, they're still getting shouted down by certain people. So I think, it's difficult, because I've also heard some comrades talking about their experiences with, like you've said there, Sarah, so-called progressives, so-called socialists, who are just, they clearly don't practice the policies of like equality that they preach around these sort of issues. So I don't know, before we come sorry, go on.
So just to say, I think that this is a big thing that I've been talking about this week as well, is violence against women is rooted in power. And we have to start talking about that structural power that men benefit from and uphold. And when men use those structural powers to belittle, humiliate, discredit, gaslight women that they don't like, whether that's they don't like them personally, or they are from different factions, or there's been some history there, and I've seen it time and time again. Senior men in the Labour Party, in the trade union movement, who use that structural power to tear down women. And we've got to start calling that out, because that is the root of where we end up. These types of using these structural powers enables the brutalization of women that can lead to violence against women. And I don't think that men who do this have necessarily got their heads around the fact that behavior leads to violence against women. And we really do need to take a stronger line against it. And I think that we also need women comrades to not let that happen to other sisters. We can disagree. And I think that the idea of sisterhood that just like ultimately binds us together isn't as helpful to the feminist movement as I think some people think it is. However, don't stand on the sidelines and watch a man tear a woman apart. and men don't stand on the sidelines. You've got to come out against that behaviour, because we're just seeing it too often. This vile misogyny that is just that's just seen as fair game in the party, especially when it's politically convenient. And it's really damaging, and it's damaging not just for the women that it's happening to, but what it's doing to encouraging and supporting women to be involved in our movement. And if we don't have women in our movement, then we are not a socialist progressive party. Talking specifically about the Labour Party, and then like the broader Labour movement, like you cannot be socialists and misogynists.
I mean, on that, Rachael, who was going to come on the show, has had a running battle for years with the former Worcester MP, who was a Labour MP. And we've got a group of young socialists in Worcestershire, and we all tweeting the same stuff. We all tweet him, sort of not sort of having a little go at him or whatever. Always Rach, who was the centre for any of his tweets, and it was just consistent. And I just think, like, looking at that, and obviously we were calling him out on it. We complained to the party several times. Nothing got done about it. You just think, well, if there was another woman who'd come to the party and wanted to get involved, why would you put your head above the parapet when that's happening to? And Rach used to travel between, like, come back to Worcester from Brighton on weekends to come campaigning for like parish elections, never mind like general elections. Like, she's an incredible activist. 2 years ago today, actually, was the climate strike in Worcester that she helped organise. Incredible activist, but she's just getting shot down. She got called an anti-Semite on the radio by this guy, and it's like, why would you see that? Why would you expose yourself to that? And then you see again that, especially with social media, that for example, you're talking about sort of the race element to it as well. You just see how Diane Abbott is treated in society. Obviously, one element of that is her race, but the other element is that she's a woman, and that's why, again, apparently because of those two factors, Diane Abbott is just seen as fair game to openly mock within as we saw with the Labour Leak report, by own Labour Party staffers.
And it also seems, if a woman makes a mistake with something or gets something wrong,
God forbid.
I know, God forbid. With Diane, she got numbers wrong to do with total of money, or to do with like some sort of sum, and she was really unwell at the time. I think it was to do with like underlying health conditions, and she was slandered for weeks. And I think, why is it that women, on one level, it's like we're held to a much higher standard. We can't lose our temper. We have to get everything right. If we say anything out of line or that isn't backed up by the Office for National Statistics, we're held to and like it's supported. We're held to this much higher standard. But then at the same time, we aren't good to do the things that men do as well. And it's like, well, you can't have it both ways. And I just think that's another element of it, that women are held to this higher standard, which opens them up to men almost to be constantly open for criticism.
Like with Diane Abbott, that you can literally go and get a degree from Cambridge and then still become the butt of a joke about maths, like problem solving. Like, shit, never mind be the first, again, go on to be the first female black MP as well, and all of that, really. So yeah,
just the way that she's treated in comparison to like Johnson, who has made a career out of being a bumbling fool. That's his whole shtick.
Exactly.
And actually, he's kind of praised for that. People love him for that. And yet, women are just held to these higher standards, and also within politics as well. That not only are women held to higher standards, they're also held accountable for men's actions time and time again. And I think that is something that we've got to call out as well, that being a woman in politics, you are just kind of, every mistake is magnified. Any mistake a man makes, you're also held accountable for that. And just that you're expected to just put up with such awful things. I think that there's a lot of talking specifically about Liverpool. the way that women councillors are spoken about on social media and our women MPs. And this isn't just from people outside the movement, this is people from within the movement. And I'm yet to see kind of serious action taken against some of these very violent imagery that they put on social media. I'm yet to see it called out as a whole, and we should be. It's absolutely not acceptable, and I think it's time that we take this more seriously, because it is the thin end of the wedge for violence against women.
I think two things you said there as well. I mean, the one thing with Boris, imagine if a female MP couldn't name how many kids they had. I mean, like,
or even this is like a whole different angle of it. But I've seen, like, they all make fun of Boris's hair, like, oh, Boris's hair is like a bit messy, looks a bit like he's been in the wind. God forbid that a woman steps out, or a celebrity woman steps out without any foundation on, and it's like, oh my God, has she got leprosy? Like, what is going on? And that's like the social media. That's a whole other thing for like another day. But yeah, just different standards, held to different standards.
I mean, it's all forgotten now that there was at one point that police were called to the Prime Minister's flat. Well, I don't know if it was the Prime Minister at the time, because he was having a very loud, audible argument with his partner, which the police had to get called for, which is now just completely forgotten. And on the Liverpool point as well, I think where I saw this sort of within the left, almost, of different sort of like, different factions of the left, when it came to the selection processes for the 2019 general election, with a couple of people stepping down in Liverpool and there was, the selection processes for MP, within the left, some of the misogyny towards the people that ended up being selected to be MP, and like it was just horrific. And then again, like you say, it's like a city like Liverpool where even there, you think the Labour Party in Liverpool, that's the bastion of the left. It doesn't mean that it's not subject to this type of stuff. It doesn't mean it at all.
Yeah, I can sort of vaguely remember from when I was at uni I only went to a few because I sort of just lost interest basically in campaigning. But I never particularly enjoyed the vibe at Liverpool CLP meetings. Sometimes they used to be, because when I was in Wolves, they were like just like 4 old men and women, and that was it. Like, it's dead. But in Liverpool, it was very vibrant. But it did attract, like, I did kind of find it really uncomfortable at times, like some of the comments that were made. And it was never it was never picked up on. It was just sort of, okay, next point, who's got their hand up? Like, and it was just sort of brushed under the carpet. But I don't know if that's changed. I haven't been. That was early. That was 2018, 2019. I don't know if it's any better now, but
I don't want to make it I don't want to make it a Liverpool point, because it's something that will be experienced up and down. But that's just where I was most active, is the time when I was in Liverpool. But I remember I was in Riverside, I think first or second year, and it was a female chair. I just thought, I remember when she was trying to keep the meeting in order, I was like, God bless you, because this is just dreadful, and she was getting so much abuse.
I think that was the one when I went to, Don, and that's the one I was referencing. We walked down, and the whole meeting was just a mess. I think Joe Anderson turned up. It was just like, what the hell? It was my first one. I was just like, Jesus Christ.
And then at the end, Joe Anderson said that we should raise council tax, and I thought the roof was going to blow off. I was like,
no. He wanted to have a referendum on whether they should increase council tax. That was his magnificent policy. Anyway,
yeah.
I think just to say, like, kind of in defense of Liverpool, I think this isn't a Liverpool issue. This is an issue across the movement. And I think that if you spoke to any woman in any CLP across the country, they would report these same instances, because the Labour Party is a part of society, and society as a whole is misogynistic, is racist, is disablist. Do you know what I mean? These issues are everywhere, and I think we do. What I would say is that I think that there are some amazing women who've come out of those meetings and been so frustrated that have mobilized and come together, and I think that is really a positive as well, of that we are kind of pushing back against it. And I think that should be, kind of commended, because it is really hard to put yourself out there and push back against quite vitriolic misogyny.
I think that's sort of chatting about the progressive spaces, and it's something that we can talk about a hell of a lot. I think maybe sort of going back to looking at some of the structural stuff with regards to sort of obviously the last week and things. I mean, one of the questions I sort of posed in the notes, sort of trying to think about things to talk about, is talking about when it comes to gendered violence. I don't know what you feel, that there seems to be a heavy focus on individuals and individual decisions. Now, ultimately, those who commit gendered violence and these acts are individuals. They have individual thinking and processes why they think this is acceptable behavior. But do you think sometimes in the narrative around all of this, there's sometimes too much a focus on individual choices rather than looking at the wider system, looking at, as we said before, the legal system, looking at the traditional family structure that sort of seems to feed into everything? I mean, in my day job, I'm a benefits advisor. Universal credit is a system that just almost actively encourages domestic violence, in the fact that if you're in a couple, you can only get paid money into one account. The only way you can get it split into an account is if you go to Universal Credit and tell them you're subject to domestic violence. They'll then pay into 2 different accounts. Now, but then what happens is that the partner then knows it's been paid into 2 different accounts. So like, it's completely like, it's everywhere, and it's just inherent in the thinking. So yeah, I don't know, Rachel, if you wanted to lead on that, for just maybe that there hasn't been enough of that stepping back and looking, and maybe that's some of the work that you've been involved in with different organisations, is stepping back. And for example, I'm really worried over the next few weeks, this is all going to become about this police officer and his mental state, and his where, as you've said before, what he's done is potentially used his police power as a way of abusing women, and that's the biggest sort of question, really.
Yeah, I think that we need to examine kind of the structural inequalities that allow this to happen. I think that in terms of universal credit is a really strong example, that so many women activists, people who work in the sector supporting survivors of domestic abuse, came forward and said, you cannot reverse the clock. Like, we fought for this, to have like the family allowance. The family allowance was to be paid into the woman's bank account. And that was like a really significant win. And that's by Eleanor Rathbone, who is a famous Liverpool woman. And that we've gone backwards. And what is so frustrating is that the government knew, because women were telling them, and quite often it's kind of like, well, that's a women's issue, and it's so easily dismissed. When you look at the support that's available for survivors of domestic abuse, and the money that's spent on it, if it is allowed to be so sidelined because of the structural inequalities that we have in society, and the position of society, and the position of women in society. And I just don't think that if this was happening to everybody and it wasn't a gendered issue, would we be in this situation? I doubt it. That the support for like rape crisis has completely fallen apart. And if you look at the criminal justice system and the value it puts on survivors who come forward and take action against their perpetrators, and so many people have been saying like this will stop survivors coming forward, and yet we're still in this situation where that can happen. Huge delays that frustrate both the victim and the victim's legal team. And this is happening, I think, because of where women's position is in society, that we're just allowed to be dismissed. And I think that this cannot be a woman's issue. This has to be a societal issue. And that's where, we do need men in the labour movement. I keep coming back to this point of like, we need men in the labour movement to use their structural positions to raise these issues, and also to give a platform to women. as well, because so often these platforms are just held on so tightly. Men being gatekeepers of power. What a shock. And actually we need to have women in positions of power, because we need these issues to be front and center, because at the moment they're just constantly dismissed, and we will not see change until those structures are deconstructed.
I mean, talk about how it's come, like sort of we talked about before, but how certain reactions have become almost natural to women in terms of having because of the fear of violence and things like that. I mean, some of the benefits advice we do for web chat, and I had someone come on web chat and say, would I still be eligible for universal credit if I leave my partner who is currently abusing me? And I was just sat there like, how the fact that that's what women's mindsets are almost encouraged to be is that, I don't know if I can. And it turns out I was doing advice and I couldn't definitively say whether she would be able to get universal credit or not. But I just had to say, look, you need to contact these people and get yourself to a safe point first, and then, get the other stuff sorted afterwards in terms of universal credit. But the fact that you lead that conversation with, I'm not sure if I can leave my abusive partner or not, because I might not get, the state system might not help me once I go. And the fact that's so ingrained, like you say, is because Boris Johnson, for example, will never have to experience that. He'll never know what that feels like. He'll have no understanding of that. I don't know, Sarah, if there's something, obviously being a counsellor as well, is that something that you said that you've been actively looking at in terms of what, I mean, you've got the great example of having women in power and what that means in terms of looking at the way that institutions are working and how they're structuring themselves and how they're looking to actively fight back against these things.
Yeah, I mean, like as a local councillor, I do have lots of women contact me who are saying they've came out of a domestic violent relationship, or they are currently in one, and I think the thing is, I think with the incident with Sarah Everard that's happened, it's drawn attention to a thing that a lot of us knew within these circles or these movements, is that we have been living through two pandemics. We've had COVID, but also violence against women and girls that has been happening in the home. And I think, for example, in Liverpool, we had a domestic abuse strategy that ended in 2020. And the approach, in fact, it was there. But one of the things from chatting to, I know a service that me and Rachael are like, we want to have more support with the Liverpool South domestic abuse team. They've said that this approach that ended in 2020 completely misses the fact that domestic abuse and violence often happens alongside rape, forced marriage, FGM and trafficking. So unless that you're having an all-encompassing approach of ending violence against girls and women, you aren't going to be able to properly tackle domestic abuse, domestic violence in the home. And the other thing is that I know, like me and Rachael and many other people within the local council, within the local Labour Party are vocal about, is that these services need more funding for the various reasons that you mentioned, Dan, so that people can go to them and get help straight away. But sadly, funding isn't seen. It's seen as a cost. Funding is seen as a cost. It's not seen as an investment. And I think if it was, and it's so sad that we have to look at things in this way and almost present it to local authorities, that if you invest this much money in like a domestic abuse service, it will result in, down the line, you won't have to invest in these funds to support women. It is an investment, it's not a cost. And there are loads of models that shows that early intervention by good, well-funded specialist services cost a fraction of the long-term costs of supporting women and children fleeing violence. And I think it's so important that we're pushing this at a local authority level. And the issue is that currently the Conservative funding model, it allows out funding for domestic abuse services, but it doesn't stretch for these services to, as I said previously, do outreach work for FGM, for trafficking, for like child sex exploitation. And because of that, you're getting this two-factor thing where you won't pick up on domestic abuse properly, and also a lot of women within ethnic minority groups, they won't get the support they need. So from a local authority level, we need to be pushing for the fact that, you know, funding to specialist services is an investment, and it needs to not just be, oh, we're going to have a room available for when a woman does decide to flee. It needs to be outreach work. It needs to be recognising that it happens alongside lots of other things. It can't just be a domestic abuse strategy. It's got to be all encompassing, ending violence against women and girls.
Yeah, I think just briefly picking up on that, Sarah, I work in social housing, and I work in complaints as well, so I have to deal with sort of applications and the complaints around that and whatnot. And we get so many like really vulnerable women who come forward saying like, my partner is abusing me, I need to get out of this home. But they are well aware that we have a waiting list of 40,000 and we have 20 properties go live a week for 40,000 people to just sort of bid on. And there's been a demise of sort of temporary accommodation as well, that the system that we're in is forcing them to stay within these environments, because if they leave, they have to either become homeless or we have like a haven centre for women within Wolverhampton. And they've probably got kids, and it's getting them to school, and it's all the massive issues. Whereas if we had an actually funded social housing system where there was enough housing for everyone, and we could say, right, we'll move you into here, or we'll move you away where he doesn't know where you live, it's completely anonymous, it would just make life 10 times easier. But the whole system and the demise of social housing has made a massive impact. And it wasn't until obviously that I got the job within social housing how important I realised social housing really is, because it's either, okay, well, you can either go to the haven, or if you do work and you've got enough money, you can go and get a private property. And then it comes with all that stuff with the private rented landlords. I mean, I know Acorn today put a tweet out saying that they doorstepped a landlord who was sexually harassing a tenant in order basically for him to stop and to get demands to pay towards a charity. But it just shows you, like, every avenue that you go down, there's just barriers there, and there's nothing there for support. I mean, our team do amazing work, but there's only so much they can do, because there's been job cuts. I mean, local authorities have been cut by 77% since the Conservatives have come in, and the work that they do really goes unnoticed. It's phenomenal work, but the facilities aren't there to cope, sadly, with the demand.
When I did debt case work, that I would say I'd say probably 75% of my clients were women, and a hell of a lot of those were debts as a result of relationship breakdown. And if not relationship breakdown, things such as forcing a woman to be a guarantor for a 15 grand loan, and then when the man left and didn't pay the loan, it was left to the woman to pay. And like, guarantor loans is like not a lot you can do about it. But like you say, Jared, this is the starkest example of what's happened in the last week about someone literally being murdered, and it's horrific. But again, it goes back to, it's the same as like I say, the parallels with the Black Lives Matter last week. It's not just about horrific police brutality, for example. It's about looking at everything and every structure, and how unequal it just all is.
Another really important thing when I'm speaking to people who run these services or work in them is that the cuts to legal aid, we know it affects the most disadvantaged in society. But there was a woman in my ward that I was supporting that, you know, was a victim of domestic violence. Thankfully, she was able to move areas and was in a good home, was like getting on with her life. Her partner found out where she was. She wanted a restraining order. She couldn't afford the legal fees. And I think we need to be looking at the fact that this is an issue that crosses every sector: housing, in the welfare system, in the legal judicial system. And we need to make sure that there is legal aid for these women that do need to, you know, put restraining orders in place, that do need to go to the courts and file for, you know, anything that will make them feel safer, even if they haven't got the money to do that. Legal aid being cut is making women more unsafe.
Yeah, and it's about as well, like, kind of what local authorities can do in terms of about looking at the cumulative impact of cuts that are having on women, on BAME people, on disabled people, and actually that it's not just cuts to domestic abuse services that offer counselling. It's also what is the support that's going into advice for them in terms of how to leave, how to manage the finances, because their partners have been extremely manipulative. They've forced them into signing things sometimes that they don't even tell them. They go and do these things behind their back, and forge signatures, or fill in information. It's about how are we making sure that they can move into a home? What are we doing to make that home secure for them? And actually, all these cuts to these different things that keep women safe, we have to look at that as a whole, and then also look at, right, that's the impact it's having. How do we now address this from a local authority perspective? And then how do we lobby the government? Because I think that we are not putting, as the Labour movement, we are not putting enough pressure on the government on these issues, that they've just been allowed to be something that junior ministers will pick up, or MPs who they're passionate about this, but they hold no portfolio. So what are we doing as that? And I also wanted to talk about the systems that are put in place. So if you look at what happened in Rochdale and Rotherham with grooming, this was an issue that people were aware of in authority, and they dismissed it. And they dismissed it on the basis that the young women who were involved were working class, that they were unable to perform to the idea of what a victim looks like. That's in quotation marks. That they led complicated lives, that they, in the words of the people that were dealing with them, were from difficult families, again, quotation marks. And I think that's a big issue as well, in terms of there is not the perfect victim, and not every victim or survivor will present themselves in the same way. And we have to recognize that some victims can come from very complicated backgrounds and not even know that they are a victim. And that was seen very much with some of the children who were involved in Rochdale and Rotherham scandals, that they didn't even know. They thought that they were in loving relationships with older boyfriends, and that the choices that they were making were, that's how it was described, they were making lifestyle choices rather than they were being groomed, that it wasn't consensual, that they were victims. And it was this really complicated layer upon layer that allowed this to happen. And that was very much an issue of structural inequality and the perception of working class people. It was the perception of women and girls, and it was also this idea that that because they didn't say I'm a victim in that very clear way, because they didn't have the relationship that the police wanted with the police, they were dismissed, and these young children were allowed to be completely left on their own, completely abandoned by the system that is supposed to be there to protect them, and it didn't. It actively put them in harm's way. And I think that we really need to look at that in terms of when we talk about defund the police, that's a massive statement. And I spoke to somebody that I know through work, and he said, "Oh my God, you're not one of them defund the police people, are you?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he was absolutely horrified. And I said, "No, when we talk about defund the police, we say we don't necessarily need to put money into quotation marks bobbies on the beat. Where is that money going into youth workers? Where is that money going into rape and sexual abuse support, or going into domestic abuse charities and services?" That's what we're talking about when we say defund the police. We're not saying we don't want a police service. We're saying that the disproportionate amount of money that is put into crime and you know, kinds of police and crime order and, you know, law and order. Couldn't think what that was called then. I just had the music of Law and Order going around in my head. Sorry. When we talk about, you know, money going into law and order, that actually, where is the support for youth services and where is the support for rape crisis? Because actually, in Rochdale, that's where the whistles were blown. It was in those voluntary services, in that voluntary sector, that people were saying, hang on a second, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. Child prostitutes don't exist because you cannot consent because you are a child. That is a term that doesn't exist. The police were using that term. So in this century, that is horrifying. And that is something that was allowed to happen because of structural inequality within the police and within social services. And this is what we've got to start peeling the layers off. And that's a massive job. And that's not going to happen this year, next year. That's got to be something that we continually have this conversation about, of people's agency, people's how people present when they're victims, how class, how race, how all these issues intersect with each other. That's what we've got to start deconstructing, and it's a massive job, and it will take all of us to play our role in that.
And I think, Rachel, just picking up briefly because you mentioned Rochdale, I think it is sadly the perfect example of how these issues can be twisted by the right as well, because obviously that was a massive thing which led to, you know, the growth of like the EDL and whatnot. And do you think, just from both of your perspective, that was a failure of the left, not to say it's an opportune, use it as an opportunity, but to have that conversation, that serious conversation about the cuts and the inequalities and the class aspects of that issue? But instead we sort of, I think there was an element of, because it was predominantly Muslim males who were doing it, who were partaking, it was sort of brushed under the carpet, do you think? Or what are your thoughts on that issue in regards to, was it really just sort of, like I said, like a missed opportunity to have that conversation on the left?
Absolutely. I think that the missing thing that wasn't spoken about was male violence. That was it. It was male violence enabled by a state, by structures that don't value the lives of working class women, that see complicated home lives as an excuse to dismiss the most despicable acts. And actually, we should have come out stronger about that. We allowed the right and the far right to completely monopolize that. There was a horrendous billboard that Nigel Farage unveiled, and it was kind of saying, these are the reasons why you need to vote UKIP, and it was the number of young girls and children that were abused. And actually what we should have been saying was, these are the reasons why you invest in services. These are the reasons why we tackle violence against women and girls in all its forms. These are the reasons why actually we don't allow the right on the far right 1 inch on this issue. They are nowhere near it, because they are part of the system that upholds these structures, that allows young girls and women to be brutalized forever. And actually we do not give them a single inch on this issue. And actually we should have come out stronger for it, and we don't. And we get frightened, I think, sometimes that because the right kind of jump on it as a race issue. It's not a race issue. It's an issue about men. It's an issue about male violence. It's an issue about classism. It's an issue about structural inequality that's allowed to exist. It's an issue about neoliberalism. It's an issue about neoliberalism, because this is what allows this inequality to exist in our society. And we should be at the forefront of this, but we don't, and we concede, and we shouldn't. Not an inch to right-wing MPs, not an inch to the far right, because they do not have the interests of women and girls at all. They are part of the problem. And I think that we need to be stronger on that, and I'm very passionate about it.
Just quickly going from Rachel's point, I mean, I'm not sure who was the leader of the opposition then, but, you know, Starmer, for example, right now, where is he? You know, there is so much that we could be pushing for, and it is not opportunistic. It's not, you know, trying to make it or politicize it, that for some reason Starmer is the leader of the political opposition, and he is so scared to politicize things. And it's like, well, what are you doing? You know, if we just wanted someone to speak about things, we could have anyone in there, but you were elected as the leader of the Labour Party, and these are political issues. These are issues that are worsened because of political choices. So why do we have a leader of the Labour Party who is not, you know, every hour putting something out saying, if the Labour Party did, I mean, if the Conservative Party didn't cut funds here, this could make things safer. And you know, I can't believe it. It's taken the trauma of the past week for the Labour Party to be like, oh, okay, we'll vote against the policing bill. Why has it got to that point?
I mean, and a couple of the points that Rachel talked about there. The one thing that, sorry, it's to go back, but I will come forward to sort of Keir Starmer. The stuff you were talking about, the class element, I watched a few weeks ago, the Yorkshire Ripper documentary that's on Netflix, which is basically 6 episodes of them, of the police basically saying the victims weren't worth their time because they were sex workers and from working class background. And then it basically turned out, because they had that attitude and because they then started, just anyone that was murdered at that time was basically just branded as a like a sex worker, so it didn't need their time. More women got killed because they weren't joining up basic dots. So that was just one thing I thought was on that.
Just quickly, Dan, before you go on that Ripper documentary, because you brought it up, and I completely forgot to make the point. They discussed in quite a lot of detail how the idea of putting curfews on women, even back then,
I was going to say
they protested against it. And I couldn't believe it when that language was coming back out, and it was like, there is the obvious evidence that they have not learned a thing in over 40 years.
That's what I wanted to talk about, is that we were talking about, like Rachel was talking about, combating, you know, these attitudes and the institutional stuff, but also we need to be very, very wary of knee-jerk reactions. E.g., Keir Starmer came straight out and said we need more police on the streets, which is so tone deaf. I mean, I can't, even from a point of view, if you're the person that maybe doesn't agree with his policies but think he's some sort of canny political operator, you have been seriously duped, because that is just, even from just like an optics point of view, what are you doing? Never mind a practical point of view. But then, yeah, as you say, the other knee-jerk reaction has been curfews on women. And yeah, 40 years on from the Ripper stuff, the debate's not moved. And then, as Sarah said before, we have supported the Spy Cops bill. That basically, I mean, if anyone hasn't seen it, BBC Wales, it's the only documentary I've seen on it. BBC Wales did a documentary about Spy Cops and about one of the women that was in an anarchist group that was infiltrated. And these are women that have essentially been raped by the state. And not only have they been raped by the state, they've now been told that they wouldn't face prosecution in the future if it happened again. Fathered children with these women as well. And then the Labour Party decided that was fine to say that these people, and even with that, they make the point in the documentary that the people that were directly involved in it, some of them were taken off the force, some of them were suspended, whatever. But there's no way that an undercover operation like that, for example, doesn't have layers. There's no way it gets sanctioned that you're going to go to Cardiff and infiltrate an anarchist group. That's not a little sort of police station decision. That's a decision way up. But nobody else has felt the repercussions of the fact that there's women out there who father children with people that were undercover police officers. And then Lush, I mean, if you remember the Lush campaign, Lush dared to say, this is wrong. And they, I think eventually they actually stopped the campaign because they were getting so much abuse, because they said that, you know, we should look into this. Sorry, that was my little rant.
it's completely, as you say, it's completely structural. And so, you know, kind of where did those decisions come from? Because actually that is a huge operation to undertake. And I think that there's been no consequences. I think just gives license for this type of behaviour. I think that if we look at the behaviour of police officers, and there are so many cases. There was a case of a black woman in London, and she had been spiked. Her drink had been spiked, and she was very distressed, as you can imagine. That's an absolutely terrifying experience to go through. She was arrested. She was taken into custody. She was stripped of all her clothing. They cut her bra off with scissors. There were males in the room when this happened. The camera was on and was coming through into the custody suite of this incident. She was absolutely terrified. This was a moment where she needed support because she had been a victim of her drink being spiked and was in a complete distressed situation, and the police acted in this way. If you look at, and that's just one example, the custody sergeant was able to just retire out before this came up for any disciplinary issues. If you look at what happened at the weekend, there is so much footage of angry police officers, male police officers, pushing and shoving women, dragging them to the floor. The woman who has been in quite a lot of the media, Patsy, she was thrown to the floor. She was pinned to the floor. And then she spoke about she had officers on her back, and then she was taken into a police van. She was asked for her name, her address, and said that she would be allowed to go if she had to accept a fine, and then she would be allowed to go. That behaviour is about punishing women. That happened. That wasn't about crowd control. That wasn't about managing a situation. That was designed to punish women who had defied the decisions that the police had made on a structural level. And then that was designed to frighten and intimidate and belittle women. And it was all done in front of cameras. And the impunity of which that officers are allowed to act time again. In Merseyside, we had anti-fascist demos, and the police were more interested in allowing fascists to have a platform in Bootle than they were for anti-fascists to equally protest against the fascists coming into a part of our community. The police response was completely over the top. My mum, so I've seen this firsthand, the impact that's had, was dragged by her hair by the police, again, in front of cameras. These acts are not individual acts. And I think that's so often that they just get dismissed as a one-time incident, but it's not a one-time incident. There are countless, and it's not just to women. The behaviour to police, to young black men who are stopped and searched on almost no grounds, and very, so many testimonies of young black men saying, for no reason whatsoever, I was stopped and searched, and the humiliation that they have to endure just for existing in public. These are all structural, and individual officers are continuously empowered to act in this way. And that's how we've got to start talking about it. What happened on Saturday of pushing and shoving women in front of, I've never seen so many cameras, in front of so many cameras, and they acted with impunity. That is something rotten to the core of the police force in this country.
And then if you think about, as Rachel was saying, the cameras, if you think about, well, what's on the other side of the cameras, in the newspapers, I think yesterday, definitely yesterday, I'm not sure today, the photos that they're using of Sarah Everard and the photos they're using of the police officer, they're picturing Sarah with a drink in the hand, like a hairstyle, she looks very relaxed. The picture of the police officer, he's by a Union Jack in his uniform, looking very patriotic. Now, I think she worked in marketing and I'm sure had lots of similar like professional photos, but they choose the one of her with a drink you know, whatever that is meant to insinuate, I don't know. But then you think, yeah, the media side of it, it just comes from so many angles.
I think with the police as well, and what you were saying, Rachel, there about they're doing it in public view, they're happy to do it in public view. I saw someone tweet, apologies to whoever it was, a really good point, that you've got to start realizing that the Met and the police generally don't care about optics. And at that point where saw lots of like liberal people and people on the right going sort of, what are the Met doing? How can they not see that this is not a bad look? Well, the point is that, well, yeah, that's the point, is that one, they don't care about optics. So you need to start questioning what they see as their role in society. And they see their role as in upholding a society that is unequal. And it is sexist and it is racist. And their role ultimately is to uphold it. And we're seeing that now. I mean, we're recording Monday night. They're going to be debating these new sweeping powers bill in Parliament today. That's going to put more power into the hands of police to suppress people protesting, inequality. I mean, some of the stuff in the bill just sounds horrific. I mean, there's one line in there that basically the police can stop a protest during these current times if there is considered to be a serious annoyance. Now, we've all been on protests. They're meant to be a serious annoyance to the people that we want people to listen to them. So I think that plays in. Me and Jared are having a bit of discussion that it's probably something for a different podcast, that it seems to have all added up now. When you mention about, you know, the treatment of black men in stop and search, that a lot of the lockdown legislation has basically allowed the police to act in this way. So they've allowed to stop and search black young men more, because we're stopping you to make sure you're following the rules when we all know what they're actually doing. And now they can suppress women trying to stand up for their rights. But you can start to see all of that within these legislations, the police are just being given more and more power. And liberals, I think, sometimes think, well, they'll use it right. You know, they're the great and the good, when they're not. If you look in the amount of women that come forward and go to the police around gender violence and nothing happens about it, it's clear they're not the good guys in this.
And I think as well, you know, funnily enough, today I had a mock exam on the separation of powers, and obviously talking about like the separation and why it's so important, so we don't have like tyranny and there's not an abuse of power itself. And one of the most important things is checks and balances. Well, where are the checks and balances against the police? I was actually talking to my niece about this, and she's going to be listening into this whenever it comes out. And we were talking about like, well, to jump back a little bit, to do with like spy cops, and then to do with like the police infiltration of certain groups. Firstly, when you think of like research ethics, if any of us have ever done a research project, the ethics forms you have to jump through to do, like, just to be able to interview someone, how did the police get away with like infiltrating and, you know, fathering children, when if you're at uni and you do a research project, all the ethics forms you have to do. And the other side of it, the checks and balances, you know, there's that, I think, is it called like Dr. Zimbardo's experiment that was to do with security officers, and they were wearing a uniform. Have you heard of that experiment? So very briefly, there was a university, there was a study happening. There was university students who came forward in America. I think it was the Stanford prison experiment. They got students all from the same university. They came, did this experiment under like a psychology professor. Half the students had to wear like prison uniforms. The other students had to wear police uniforms. I think the study was meant to last over 2 weeks and got called off within 5 or 6 days, because the students in the police security guard uniform actually started physically abusing the students in the prisoner uniforms. And it's like, and I'm sure there's far much more literature and studies done on the fact that if you put a uniform on someone, that already gives them like another sense of ego. If you've then got the entire of the British state behind you saying you can do this, and you know, the fact that if a soldier has like prosecutions against them longer than 5 years ago, it will be completely be dropped. You are going to feel that you are above the law, and you are going to feel very limitless, and that is extremely dangerous.
And it comes back to what you both said at the start, that it all ultimately comes down to power dynamics and abuse of power and things like that. wary of the time. I don't want to take all your evening, but I don't know if we maybe want to talk about some of the groups that are cropping up and some of the groups that you've been involved in, and some of the things that you've done. I know you've sort of both been involved with Reclaim the Night, and there's different ones as Reclaim the Streets around the UK and things like that. What's some of the things that you've already seen just this week that people have actively wanted to do? I know it's difficult in terms of organising with COVID and everything else. But yeah, just some of the things you've seen already and some shout outs you want to do for any organising and things that people can get involved in and things like that.
I think that for I'm part of a group in Liverpool called Reclaim the Night. We were refounded in 2013, and that was about coming together to campaign for end against violence against women, and gendered violence, and kind of this culture that takes an impact on every part of women's lives, and trans women and non-binary people. And what we found is a lot of people have been reaching out to us who maybe have never been involved in activism before. And I think that's really powerful that we are able to offer this space. We march every year. We haven't been able to march because of COVID. So we are planning to march in October, when we hope that it'll be a safer time for us to do it. But we're planning lots of kinds of different levels of activism, because I think people do want to raise their voices, and we have to think about how we can do that, and especially how we do it in a safe way as well, because I know we have a lot of women who are shielded, or there is different issues that they can't come out onto the street. So it's like, how do we provide a platform to as many people as possible, as well as how do we get out onto the streets? And I think that it is really important that we have that opportunity to raise our voices, because I think that for so many, it's just something that we accept, this low-level misogyny, this dull background noise, as I said at the beginning. And it's about how we now come out and challenge that together and collectively. And I think it's been a really tough kind of week for a lot of women, and having that space has been really important. And so I think we want to definitely do more stuff around allowing women together and just be together as women. And it being a really inclusive space. Trans women are very much welcome in our space in Reclaim the Night Liverpool, and non-binary people. We're collectively campaigning against gender violence, and I think that we absolutely stand in solidarity. And I think that's been really powerful of all this kind of collective anger and grief and sorrow, but also this unifying call to say, this is enough. This needs to be a moment. This needs to be a movement beyond this moment. And I think that's been really, really wonderful to see amongst what is possibly, a very tough week. And also the grief can't be underestimated, that for not just for Sarah, but for her family, her friends, and so many other women who we know have died at the hands of men and gendered violence.
I mean, earlier on in the week, I text Rachael and I was like saying, I just don't know what we can do about this. And Rachel's like, I feel the same way, because we are all separate at the moment and we can't have that benefit of being together. I think a lot of women are racking their brains and thinking, what can we do? But I think purely by talking about it and putting these conversations and these topics into your workplace, into your conversations with friends, into, if you're a teacher, if you go back into the school and you're talking to staff about it, talking about it is a good step forward and giving it the platform that it needs. I'd also say Sisters Uncut are doing really good work and they're challenging the policing bill. I've got in touch with them and I just sent them an email on their Twitter saying I'm a counsellor in Liverpool. I don't know what I can do to help, but I want to help. And I would love to think that they haven't got back to me yet because their inbox is flooded with the same messages. I think, if, for example, you see a fundraiser and it's saying, and you don't have money to donate to it, that's fine. Just share it. just things like that. Let's just keep it out there. Let's make sure that when the tabloids and the press stop reporting on it, that we keep it at the forefront. And
to go back to what we said before about progressive spaces, if you are an activist and an organizer, review what you're doing in order, I'm certainly, as a result of this, gonna really look at what I'm doing. Example, from our trade union branch, what are we actively doing? Because it sort of seems, I think there's sometimes a lazy assumption, and I'm gonna, I'm probably guilty of that at sometimes, where you were talking about, just having the one person on the committee as a women's officer, and you sort of think, well, what we meant to do, if women aren't coming forward to put themselves up for roles, I mean, we were trying, but it's like, well, it's more than just sort of opening roles up. It's about actively reaching out to women and saying, like, what do we need to do to make these spaces safer and more accommodating and somewhere you want to be and get involved in. And I know, obviously, me and Jared as trade unionists and trade union organisers would be something that I definitely want to discuss more about and be more active upon. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Jared?
No. Thank you both for coming on. It's been really inspirational. I think you're both very brave as well for discussing your personal experiences, especially that like rallying cry, Rachel, after the question asked about Rochdale. I had like goosebumps after that.
Yeah,
it was so good.
I got shivers.
I was like, oh my God, I was going to cry.
I literally shivered in my seat. I was like,
it's like Sarah saying,
the perfect clip for us to send out, by the way, Dan. It's done.
Yeah, I think it's like Sarah was saying before, though, is that because we've had that inability as people on the left and socialists and activists to like let out some of this stuff, when you hear someone else letting it out, it just, like, obviously you've heard people talk like that in other meetings and at protests before. It just feels great to be chatting to to socialists and organisers about this type of stuff. It's group therapy. I said it before. That's the only reason I do this.
No, I think it is good to get it out and to encourage other people to talk about it as well. And I think that this as well is saying that this is what we need the Labour movement to really be championing and to be pushing. These are the type of things. And just really briefly, not to start the whole conversation again, but just to say that, we are the Labour Party, we are the Labour movement. And it's not about following public opinion. It's about influencing public opinion. And we have an absolute responsibility to be doing that. Not through focus groups, not through what's palatable for the Daily Mail, not what we can get people who this isn't their key issue to understand. We need to be leading that discussion, that debate, and pushing this forward, because if not us, who? And that is my rallying call to the Labour front bench. If it's not you, who's going to do it? Who's going to speak up for us? Because I'm not prepared to walk away from parliamentary representation, from local authority representation. It's about saying that if I'm going to put an X in the box for the Labour Party, what am I getting back? Lead the conversation. You have a duty to the thousands and thousands and thousands of women and girls who live their daily lives in fear of male violence. You have to step up. You have to be there for us. Because if it's not you, then who?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, you go on Keir Starmer's Twitter. I don't know why I do it if I want to wind myself up. And it's just like another day in the office. It's like, do you understand what is happening within your political party, within wider society? Why is it that when I'm looking on your Twitter, it's just like bland? The leader of the opposition is not shouting about this, is not saying he's disgusted in it. He's concerned. Well, I think it is such a privilege to just be concerned about it.
But how powerful would it be? I mean, we spoke before that he has tweeted about his how disappointed he is in the Crown Prosecution Service for their actions around these issues, despite being the director of public prosecutions. But how powerful would it be if he came out and just said, "I didn't do enough, and during my time,
we got it wrong. Yeah,
during my time, this is what happened, and it was under my watch, and I didn't do enough, and I was part of the problem." And you get so much respect for that. But like you say, it's back to the days of policy by focus groups and what is, and again, but I've got to say, me and Jared were saying before, during Corbyn there was, for example, stuff around policing. Too much of the conversation was more Bobbies on the beat, way too much of the conversation, and that was clear because it was a vote winner that was a large part of the conversation. So it's, again, and that's probably something at the time that I didn't call out because I thought, it's a difficult conversation to have, on the doorstep and whatever. But it's going past that factualism and just saying, well, what's Tony Benn's thing of basically being a signpost and not blowing in the wind and whatever, sort of, putting your views out there and sticking to them. And like you say, Rachel, trying to form some sort of narrative just about anything about how we want society to look. But we end up speaking about him every fucking podcast.
I hate it. He always comes up.
It's got to that point now where his mention, I feel like you could do, if you did like an MRI scan of my brain and you put pictures of his face up, you'd see like bits would just inflame that I just can't. I've gone past the rational point now. Because he's not even good at what he's meant to be good at, but we'll just by the by. Well, thanks so much. I think this has been probably one of the most important discussions we've had. Like I said, it feels like similar discussions we were having last summer about properly reviewing everyday actions of people, your friends, your family, calling out sort of comments, calling out actions that once, a couple of years ago, you might have just let go because you thought it was maybe too embarrassing to say something about it. So thanks so much for coming on. For the listeners, I will go to the episode notes because we'll just include loads of links to different things, different ways of getting involved, different things to pledge money to. As Sarah said, if you can't pledge money, it's tough out there. There's a million other ways you can get involved with different things. So thanks so much for coming on, guys. And we'll see you next time, everybody.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
El patriarcado es un juez.